I stood frozen in the middle of my parents' living room, unable to move or speak. My eyes locked onto the stack of legal documents, spread across the old coffee table, the one that had sat in that same spot for decades. The air in the room felt thick, like it hadn't moved in years. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My brother, James, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed and lips curled into a smirk. My parents sat nearby, looking proud, almost gleeful. I should have seen this coming, but I didn't. "We're signing over Oak Ridge to James," my father said, his tone calm, like he was announcing what was for dinner. "It's time to pass the estate on to the next generation." I blinked, still not fully absorbing what he was saying. Oak Ridge, our family estate, my grandfather's estate, the only place that ever felt like home. What they didn't know, and what I hadn't planned to say today, was that Oak Ridge wasn't theirs to give. Not really. 20 years ago, my grandfather had quietly created a trust. I was the sole trustee. I had full legal authority over the entire property. And for the past 10 years, I'd been the one secretly covering the estate's debts, maintenance costs, property taxes, repairs, while they played favorites and lavished attention on James. Now they were trying to give away something that wasn't even legally theirs. And I stood there, in the home I'd silently protected, wondering whether I should reveal the truth or walk away from everything I had fought for. The message came in earlier that week. A casual text from my mother. "Darling, please join us this weekend. Your father and I have exciting news. James and Catherine will be here too." Nothing about it struck me as odd. We'd had monthly dinners at Oak Ridge ever since I moved to the city 8 years ago. Though, truthfully, they'd gotten harder over time. The difference in how they treated me versus James had become painfully obvious. Still, I always came. Some part of me never gave up hoping something might shift. The drive out to Oak Ridge was familiar. 40 minutes from my downtown apartment, winding through peaceful country roads. The iron gates creaked open slowly, revealing the tree-lined path up to the house. Century-old oaks towered above the drive, the ones that gave the estate its name. And there it was, the 3-story Victorian home, its stone walls weathered but dignified. A turret stood proudly at the corner. Oak Ridge had been in our family since 1887. 5 generations of Harringtons had been born, raised, and buried here. And even though I had my own life in the city, this was the place that always felt like mine. James's shiny new Range Rover was parked at the front entrance. No surprise there. Another gift from our parents. I pulled in beside it, my modest sedan looking painfully out of place. I grabbed the bottle of wine I'd brought and headed to the front door. I hesitated for a moment before using my key. No matter how they acted, I was still a Harrington. This was still my home, too. "Alexandra, you're here," my mother called from the kitchen. She walked in drying her hands on a dish towel, her silver-streaked hair pinned back neatly. She gave me a brief hug, the scent of her expensive perfume catching in my throat. "It hadn't changed since I was a child. James and Catherine are in the study with your father," she said with a smile. "Dinner's almost ready." I followed the sound of laughter to the study. Sure enough, there they were, my father, James, and Catherine, leaning over a table full of papers. Their voices fell quiet when I entered. "Alex," my father said, standing to greet me. Edward Harrington, tall, polished, with sharp blue eyes that matched mine. Even at 65, he still carried the air of a man who ran things. A successful corporate lawyer, the kind who always seemed to be 2 steps ahead. Perfect timing. "We were just discussing something we wanted to share with you." James looked up, wearing that all too familiar expression, half smug, half dismissive. He was 2 years younger than me, 35, and followed Dad into law. Now he worked at the firm, already being groomed for succession. "Hey, sis, glad you made it," he said, casually flipping a page. Catherine, his wife, gave me a tight smile. "Lovely dress," she said. Her tone made it sound more like a jab than a compliment. Before I could say anything, my mother called us to the dining room. The table was set the way it always had been: fine china, crystal glasses, polished silver. Even with just 5 of us, At one end of the long table, the presentation was formal. My mother's roast lamb filled the air with the smell of rosemary. It should have felt comforting. Instead, everything felt staged. Dinner conversation started off light. Local politics, Catherine's charity work, James's latest courtroom victory. I answered questions about my job senior curator at the art museum, but kept it brief. They never really cared to hear more. It had taken me 8 years to earn my doctorate in art history, and I was proud of the work one did. But around this table, none of it ever seemed to matter. Then came dessert apple tart, my mother's specialty. And that's when my father cleared his throat. "Alexandra," he said, his voice shifting into that careful tone he used when delivering big news. "Your mother and I have been thinking about the future, and we've made a decision." She reached for his hand, her eyes warm with anticipation. "We're not getting any younger, sweetheart. And with James and Catherine planning to start a family, it seems like the right time to pass Oakridge on." My stomach tightened. I placed my fork down gently. "We've decided to transfer ownership of Oakridge to James," my father said. "The paperwork is almost finalized. We'll still live here, of course. But legally, the estate will belong to James and Catherine by the end of the month." The words spun around in my head, slow and heavy. I had been paying for this place for 10 years, quietly, secretly. While they gave my brother Range Rovers and praise, I was the one who'd kept the estate from falling apart. And now, they were giving it away? I don't understand," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "Why now? And why wasn't I part of this discussion?" My father let out a sigh, the kind that made it sound like I was the one being unreasonable. "Alexandra," he said, folding his hands. "James is the natural choice. He's working at the firm, he's starting a family. He'll carry on the Harrington name and the business. It just makes sense for him to have Oakridge." It took every ounce of self-control not to react right then and there. My throat tightened, but I kept my face steady. "And what about me?" I asked quietly, barely able to get the words out. James let out a short laugh and shook his head, like I'd asked something silly. "Come on, Alex. What would you do with this place? You live in that little apartment downtown. You work in a museum. Oakridge needs someone who can really take care of it." The irony in that statement was staggering. It hit me like a slap. For a second, I couldn't even speak. If only they knew. 10 years. 10 years. I had been paying the bills they didn't see: property taxes, roof repairs, staff wages, heating in the dead of winter, quiet transfers from my personal account into a trust they didn't even know existed. They thought I wasn't capable of taking care of Oakridge, but I was the only reason it hadn't gone under. The only reason Oakridge still stood with its windows intact and the grounds cared for was me. My grandfather, Harrison Harrington, had seen this coming. He was the one who truly knew me. He'd seen how I connected with this place, not as a status symbol, but as a legacy, a living, breathing history. Before he passed, he set up the trust, naming me sole trustee the moment I turned 21. And he asked for just one thing: keep it quiet, unless it absolutely had to be revealed. And I had done just that. "I see," I said at last, setting my napkin beside my plate, though my hands were shaking underneath the table. "So this decision is final? We thought you'd be happy for your brother," my mother chimed in, clearly puzzled. "This is about securing the future. The Harrington legacy." That word legacy hung in the air like a cruel joke. They had no idea what that word really meant. Legacy wasn't just passing down a property. It was preserving it, honoring the people who built it, who lived and died under its roof. And they were giving it away, like a housewarming gift. I looked around the table, the polished chandelier overhead, the fine silverware glinting under the lights, James's smug expression, Catherine sipping her wine like nothing had happened. And none of them had a clue that the house they were talking about wasn't legally theirs to give. The documents on the study table, the ones they were so eager to push through, they meant nothing without my signature, and I was the only one who knew that. "May I see the paperwork?" I asked, keeping my voice even. James hesitated, but eventually slid the folder across the table. It's just standard stuff, he said. Dad's firm took care of everything. I opened the folder slowly. The legal language was familiar. I had reviewed enough estate documents in my role as trustee to know exactly what I was looking for. The paperwork named my parents as full owners of Oak Ridge, transferring all rights and responsibilities to James and Catherine Harrington. Not one mention of the trust. Not one acknowledgement of the Harrison Harrington Trust that had held the title for the past 15 years. Did Walter Jenkins review these? I asked, knowing full well the answer. Walter was our family's estate attorney, the only person besides me and my grandfather who knew about the trust. He had been grandfather's trusted advisor for decades, and the one who helped set everything up. My father waved a hand. Walter's practically retired. Graham from the firm is handling it. Why? I looked down at the papers again. The neat signatures, the misplaced confidence in ink. No reason, I replied, setting the folder down with a calm I didn't feel, just curious. My mother's face lit up, misreading my response as approval. Wonderful. We'll throw a proper celebration when everything's finalized. Maybe even a housewarming party for James and Catherine. Wouldn't that be lovely? I smiled back, but it didn't reach my eyes. After dinner, I made my excuses and left early. Claimed I had an early meeting the next morning, which wasn't entirely a lie. As I walked to my car, the cool night air hit me in the face, sharp and grounding. The driveway crunched beneath my shoes as I passed the gardens I had paid to restore, the carriage house I'd financed to keep from collapsing, the roof I had had re-shingled just last year. They were all proud to hand it over, never once asking how it had stayed standing. As I pulled away from Oak Ridge, the house began to fade in my rearview mirror. Its windows glowed warmly from within, but I couldn't feel it tonight. Not like I used to. It felt distant. This wasn't just about a house. This was about what it meant to be part of a family that didn't see you, that didn't value you, that only remembered your name when they needed something or thought they had something to give away. I had a choice to make. I could reveal the trust now and stop them in their tracks, or I could stay quiet, let the transfer fail naturally when Graham's team discovered the truth. But either way, that moment was coming. Sooner or later, they'd find out that the estate didn't belong to them, and they'd realize the person they had spent years overlooking was the one holding it all together. But tonight, I needed time. I needed space to breathe, to think, to gather my strength. Because this was no longer just about property. This was about identity, about legacy, about finally standing up and being seen. The next morning, I arrived at the Metropolitan Museum of Art earlier than usual. The city streets were still waking up, but I needed the quiet. My office, tucked into a quiet corner overlooking the sculpture garden, felt like a small haven in a world that was suddenly moving too fast. I set my coffee down and stared out the window for a long moment, watching the early sunlight stretch across the pavement below. I had always loved this part of the day, the hush before the noise. But this morning, it didn't feel peaceful. It felt heavy. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I hadn't dialed in years, Walter Jenkins. My thumb hovered over the call button. He was the one person outside of myself who knew everything. My grandfather's instructions had been clear. Reach out to Walter only when it became absolutely necessary. And now, it was. He picked up on the third ring. His voice was raspy, warm, aged like a favorite old armchair one that had seen better days, but still held its shape. Alexandra Harrington, he said, sounding more amused than surprised. To what do I owe the pleasure? Good morning, Walter. Do you have time to meet today? Something's come up regarding the trust. There was a pause. I imagined him leaning back in his chair, processing my words. I see, he said thoughtfully. Yes, I can make time. Shall we say noon? At Westfields? Westfields, a private club in Midtown where Walter liked to conduct business. Old world, quiet, discreet. I hadn't been there since my grandfather passed. It felt appropriate. I'll be there, I said, already rearranging my day in my mind. The next few hours moved in a blur. I reviewed exhibition notes, glanced through acquisition proposals, answered a few staff questions, but none of it really stuck. My assistant, Marcus, gave me a curious look at one point, but didn't pry. He knew better. I was operating on autopilot, saving all my energy for noon. By 11:30, I was in a cab heading downtown. The closer we got to Westfields, the more the city noise seemed to fade. It was like stepping back in time. The dark mahogany paneling, oil portraits, and hushed atmosphere hadn't changed in 20 years. I was escorted to Walter's usual table, tucked into the far corner. He was already there, a glass of scotch resting beside him. I slid into the seat across from him, declining the waiter's offer of a drink. "You look tired," he said, not unkindly. "I am," I admitted. "But more than that, I'm angry." "I figured," he said, his eyes steady. "Tell me what's going on." I gave him the full rundown: the dinner, the surprise announcement, the legal documents spread out like a birthday card, the smug look on James's face, and the way my parents had acted like I should be grateful. I told him about the years I'd been paying for Oak Ridge in silence, how the trust remained hidden even as they assumed the house was theirs to give away. Walter listened closely, occasionally nodding, his hands folded over his glass. When I finished, he leaned back and let out a long, slow breath. "Alexandra, your parents cannot legally transfer Oak Ridge. The estate is held in the Harrison-Harrington Trust, and as you know, you are the sole trustee. They have no authority, none at all." "I know that," I said quietly, "but they don't, and they're moving forward like it's already done." "Your grandfather was wise to structure things this way," Walter said, his voice more serious now. "He foresaw this very situation. He saw your character, your connection to the family's legacy, and he saw, unfortunately, the way your parents handle money and people." The waiter returned with our lunch, a Caesar salad for me, steak for Walter. We paused while he poured water and retreated. "What are my options?" I asked, picking at a crouton, my appetite long gone. Walter cut into his steak with the kind of focus only older men and surgeons seem to have. "You have several paths forward. None are particularly easy. You could reveal the trust immediately. That would stop the transfer cold, but it would also cause a major rift in the family. Or you could let the transfer process move forward until their legal team uncovers the trust. At that point, it'll hit a brick wall, and the truth will come out whether you want it to or not." He paused, his eyes meeting mine. "Or you could dissolve the trust and allow the transfer to proceed." I looked up, shocked. "Dissolve it? After everything I've done to keep that place afloat?" "I'm not recommending that," he said gently. "I'm just laying out the options. Your grandfather was explicit about his wishes. Oak Ridge was to be preserved under your stewardship. You were his safeguard." I leaned back in my chair, suddenly exhausted. I thought of all the vacations I never took, the shoes I didn't buy, the careful budgeting that let me slip extra dollars into the trust to pay the bills they never even knew existed. And for what? So James and Catherine could turn the East Wing into a nursery and forget the rest? Walter took another sip of his scotch, watching me carefully. "There's one more thing," he said finally. "Something I've been holding on to for years." He opened his briefcase and pulled out a cream-colored envelope, sealed and slightly yellowed with time. My grandfather's handwriting was on the front. "For Alexandra, when the time comes." My heart skipped. "He left this for you 15 years ago," Walter said. "You were to receive it either when the trust was revealed or on your 40th birthday, whichever came first." I opened it carefully. Inside was a single page of thick stationery, my grandfather's handwriting flowing in strong, elegant script. "My dearest Alexandra, if you're reading this, the time has come to understand the full truth. Oak Ridge is more than a family home. It represents our heritage, our values, and a responsibility to preserve something greater than ourselves. I chose you because I saw strength in you, strength the others never cultivated. Your parents and your brother possess admirable qualities, but they lack the vision to see past their own needs. That's not entirely their fault. Privilege can blind people to sacrifice. The final provision in this trust gives you full authority over Oak Ridge. You can preserve it, pass it to someone of your choosing, or transform it into a historical foundation. The decision is yours, and yours alone. Whatever you choose, know that my faith in you has never wavered. With love and complete confidence, Grandfather Harrison the first stared at the letter until the words blurred. Then I looked up at Walter, blinking through tears I didn't realize had formed. He knew this day would come, I whispered. He did, Walter replied softly, and he trusted you to do what's right. The letter rested in my lap like it weighed 100 pounds. Even folded, it felt like a turning point, like a door swinging open to a future I hadn't fully prepared for. I looked out the window of Westfields, past the manicured hedges and wrought iron gates, letting my thoughts settle around the truth I now had in writing. I wasn't just preserving Oak Ridge, I was the one meant to decide its future, and that was terrifying. I've been making the mortgage payments, I said quietly, staring down at the rim of my water glass. I've paid the taxes, the staff, the repairs, for 10 years. They have no idea, Walter nodded, his expression one of quiet understanding. Your grandfather knew you'd do that. He may not have said it aloud, but he trusted that you'd take it on. Not out of obligation, but because you believed in what the estate stood for. My hands trembled slightly as I tucked the letter back into its envelope. I couldn't remember the last time someone told me they believed in me, not with that kind of clarity. The people, who should have said it most, had stayed silent for so long that even I had started to wonder whether I mattered to them at all. They're going to be furious when they find out, I said. Humiliated, maybe. And James will feel betrayed. Walter sighed and leaned back in his chair. Perhaps. But truth has a way of clearing the air, even if it's messy at first. They've been living under a false understanding. Maybe it's time that changes. He reached for his briefcase again, producing a second folder. Here's what you asked for. Documentation to confirm your authority as trustee. I've included a summary, the original trust paperwork, financial records of your contributions, and a legal statement affirming your position. I ran my hand across the smooth leather of the folder. This was it, everything I would need to speak the truth on my terms. Thank you, Walter, I said, my voice thick. Not just for this, but for holding the line all these years. He smiled gently. I was just the gatekeeper. You were the one doing the work. After we parted ways, I wandered for a bit. I didn't go straight back to the museum or head home. I found myself drawn towards Central Park, to the quieter areas near the lake, where the sounds of the city dulled into the rustle of leaves and the distant splash of ducks on the water. I found an empty bench and sank into it. It was spring. The scent of magnolia and new grass drifted in the breeze. Couples walked hand in hand. An older man threw breadcrumbs to birds. Life moved forward, even when your world felt paused in place. I pulled the letter out again and read the last few lines, not just for the property, but for our family's true legacy. I could still hear Grandfather's voice in my mind. He'd never needed to raise it to make an impact. His strength came from patience, from observing, from choosing his words carefully. That's what I needed to do now. I couldn't just storm into Oak Ridge, slam the paperwork down, and demand they listen. That wasn't what this was about. If I wanted to preserve the estate and my family, if that was still possible, I'd need to be deliberate, strategic, calm, and I had to decide soon. The title search at my father's firm would uncover the trust eventually. That clock was already ticking. But if I could get ahead of it, bring the truth forward myself, maybe I could shape how it landed. I pulled out my phone and opened my messages. There it was. James, Mom wants to know if you're coming to dinner Sunday. She and Catherine want to go over renovation plans for the East Wing. Renovation plans for a house they didn't own. The audacity of it nearly made me laugh. It was so them to assume, to plan, to forge ahead without ever asking if anyone else had thoughts. I started typing, then erased it, tried again. Finally, I wrote, I'll be there. We have a lot to discuss about Oak Ridge. I slipped my phone back into my bag and leaned against the back of the bench. The sky above had shifted, a soft orange hue painting the horizon as the sun prepared to slip away. I watched it for a while, feeling something shift inside me too. Not peace, exactly, not yet, but clarity, and a strange sense of calm that came with it. Because no matter what happened next, I knew who I was. I knew what I had done, and I knew what I was capable of. Maybe that's something we all forget at times, especially when we've spent years being overlooked. We start to believe the small version of ourselves that others see. But the truth? The truth is, when we've poured ourselves into something quietly, day after day, it leaves a mark. It matters, even if no one notices right away. So if you're listening to this and you've ever felt unseen or dismissed by the people who should have known your worth, hold on to this. You don't need their permission to stand in your truth. You don't need their applause to know you've done something meaningful. Sometimes, strength isn't loud. It's silent, steady, patient. And when the moment comes to speak, it echoes. Sunday arrived with a gray sky hanging heavy over the city. I woke before my alarm, my stomach already tight. Outside my window, the rain had started light at first, just enough to blur the glass. Fitting, I thought. There was something about the weather that felt appropriate. Like even the skies understood. This wasn't just another family dinner. I took my time getting ready. I wanted to look composed, but not too formal. Strong, but approachable. I chose a navy blue dress that I always felt good in, simple, confident, not flashy. I pinned back my hair, slipped the letter from my grandfather into my purse, and checked once more that Walter's portfolio was there too. This wasn't going to be a confrontation. At least, I didn't want it to be. But it was going to be a turning point. The rain picked up as I drove, tapping steadily against the windshield as Oak Ridge came into view. There were more cars in the drive than usual. I recognized Catherine's parents' silver Mercedes and a black BMW. I didn't recognize probably Graham Sutton, the firm's attorney. They weren't wasting time. It wasn't just dinner anymore. This was a strategy meeting. I parked at the side of the house near the old garage. It might have been small, but it had always been my spot growing up, when I drove that hand-me-down Honda my grandfather gave me. James had always parked in front, right near the entrance, just another quiet reminder of how things were divided. By the time I reached the front door, my dress was speckled with raindrops, and my hair had gone a little damp. I didn't care. Let them see me as I was real, not polished for their comfort. Catherine opened the door before I could knock. She looked as flawless as ever, cream-colored slacks, crisp blouse, not a strand of hair out of place. "Alexandra," she said, giving me a once-over. "You're a little wet. Would you like a towel?" "I'm fine," I said simply, stepping past her. Inside, the house looked the same, but it felt different. Voices floated in from the drawing room, my father's assertive tone, my mother's polite laugh, and the lower murmur of a man I didn't recognize. Graham, I assumed. The hallway smelled like lemon polish and fresh flowers. Mrs. Winters, the housekeeper, had clearly been working hard, probably under the impression that some grand new chapter was about to begin. She didn't know that chapter might never be written. As I entered the drawing room, 6 heads turned toward me. My parents, James and Catherine. The Prestons, Catherine's parents. And Graham Sutton, young, sharp-suited, with that polished confidence of a man who thought he knew how this was all going to go. My mother smiled, rising to greet me. "Alexandra, you remember Richard and Diana Preston," she said. "And this is Graham Sutton, he's handling the transfer." I shook hands all around. Polite, but distant. Graham's grip was firm, and I caught the way his eyes lingered on me, curious, assessing. "Sorry I'm a bit damp," I said lightly. "Caught in the rain." "We were just discussing the final timeline," my father said, waving toward the coffee table where more paperwork sat. "Graham thinks we can wrap everything up by Friday." My heart beat a little faster. "Friday? That was less than a week away." "That's quicker than I expected," I replied, accepting a glass of wine from my mother. I needed something to hold, even if I didn't drink it. "Barring any surprises," Graham said, with a small smile, "everything's moving right along. The title search hasn't turned up anything concerning so far." The irony of that statement nearly made me choke. I looked around the room, everyone beaming, excited, so sure of themselves. Catherine was already talking about renovations, turning the East Wing into a home office for James, expanding the closets, adding a nursery. A nursery. My mother gasped. "Are you pregnant?" "Not yet," Catherine said with a smile. "But we're planning. Once the estate's officially ours, we'll start trying. Of course they were. That was the moment I felt something shift in me. The house, the one I had quietly saved from falling apart, was being carved up like a party cake. Rooms assigned, walls planned for demolition, and not a single one of them had asked what I thought. Because they didn't think I mattered. "Alexandra, you've been so quiet," my mother said suddenly. "Don't you have anything to say about your brother's exciting news?" All eyes turned to me. This was my chance. I could have laid it all out, right then slid the trust documents across the table, shattered their assumptions like glass. But I didn't. Not yet. "Congratulations," I said smoothly, my voice steady. "Children will certainly bring new life to Oak Ridge." I saw my father relax. He thought the storm had passed. But he didn't know I was just waiting for the right moment. Later, as we moved into the dining room, Graham walked beside me. "I hear you're a curator," he said. "At the Met," I replied, taking a seat. "Impressive. You must appreciate a place like Oak Ridge. All that history." "You have no idea," I said, a touch of dry humor slipping out. He tilted his head, sensing something. "You don't seem entirely comfortable with this transfer. Is something bothering you?" I smiled politely. "I'm just surprised how fast it's moving. Oak Ridge has been in the family for generations. I'd think that would merit more caution." He nodded. "We're conducting a thorough title search, but so far, nothing unusual." I took a sip of wine, the taste sharp on my tongue. Not yet, I thought. But the clock is ticking. Dinner dragged on, course after course. Talk of paint colors, pool houses, kitchen remodels. James assured everyone they'd preserve the historical parts, as if throwing that in made everything okay. I kept my expression neutral, but every word stung. I had paid for the preservation. I had saved the ceiling they dined under. I had restored the floorboards they walked across. All of it on my dime, and they had no idea. At one point, my mother casually mentioned that I'd restored the library ceiling. She found old photos, had it repainted exactly like the original. Even Catherine looked surprised. "I didn't know you were into restoration." I smiled faintly. "There's a lot about me. This family doesn't know." An uncomfortable silence settled for a moment. Later, as dessert was served, Graham turned to me again. "Alexandra, as a family member, you'll need to sign a quitclaim deed to clear the title. Of course. The final formality. The part where I legally stepped aside. I'll review it when it arrives," I said coolly. That night, as I pulled out of the driveway, I felt something different. Not fear, not dread. Something stronger. Readiness. They were planning to take everything, but the foundation beneath their plans wasn't theirs. And I was done being silent. So, to anyone listening who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed by the people closest to you, please hear this. You are not invisible. Just because they don't see your strength doesn't mean it isn't there. Sometimes the people who hold things together do it so quietly, the rest of the world forgets to look. But one day, they will. And when they do, they won't just see what you've done, they'll realize who you've been all along. The rain had stopped by the time I reached home. A soft mist hung over the city like a curtain, muffling the noise outside and wrapping everything in a strange hush. I slipped off my shoes, poured a cup of tea I didn't touch, and stood by the window, looking out at nothing in particular. I couldn't stop thinking about the way James looked at me when he said, "You'll always have a place here," as if I were some distant cousin they'd let stay in the guest room once in a while. As if the estate I'd kept alive room by room, invoice by invoice, was theirs to grant me access to. It was the arrogance that got to me most, not the decision itself, but the way they were all so sure, so certain I would quietly step aside while they claimed the legacy I'd protected in silence for a decade. I wasn't angry, not in that hot, reckless way. It was something colder now, a steady burn in my chest that didn't rise or fall. It just sat there, humming, reminding me that I had work to do. The next morning, I was in my office at the museum by 7:30. I closed the door behind me, laid the trust documents on the desk, and stared at them for a moment. Walter had done everything meticulously. The original deed transfer into the Harrington Trust, my role as trustee, detailed financial records of my contributions, and a legal summary explaining the implications. I didn't need to read it all again. I knew every word by heart. It was time. I picked up the phone and called Walter. He answered on the first ring. "I've made my decision," I said. "I'm ready to reveal the trust, but I want to do it on my terms. Not as a fight, not as some courtroom surprise." "I thought you might," he said, his voice calm. "How do you want to proceed?" "I want documentation clean and clear that confirms the trust's authority and my legal standing. Then I want to speak with Graham Sutton, privately. Before he discovers the trust during the title search, I want the truth to come from me, not from a scanned document in some legal file." Walter's approval was clear. "That's a wise approach, Alexandra. I'll have everything prepared by noon. You'll have the documents in your hands by early afternoon." As soon as we hung up, I called Graham's office. His assistant was polite but hesitant. "He's booked solid until next week," she said. "Tell him this is regarding the Oak Ridge transfer," I said, keeping my tone even. "There's a legal matter that will significantly impact the process." There was a pause. Then, "One moment, please." Less than 30 seconds later, I was transferred directly. "Alexandra," Graham said, all professional warmth now. "I was actually about to call you about the quitclaim deed. That's part of why I'm calling," I said. "There are some matters related to Oak Ridge's ownership that need to be addressed right away. I'd like to meet with you today, if possible, in person." There was a beat of silence. "Should I be concerned?" "I think we should talk before any further steps are taken," I replied, careful not to give too much away. "I believe this is in everyone's best interest, including yours." He didn't hesitate after that. 3 o'clock, my office. Perfect. By early afternoon, I was standing in the lobby of Blackwell and Associates, the same firm my father had built his career at, the same firm where James now strutted around like he owned the place. The irony wasn't lost on me. Graham's office was on the 34th floor, all glass walls and sweeping views of the city. He rose when I entered, motioned me toward the conference table rather than the smaller chairs across from his desk. It was a subtle acknowledgement. He understood this wasn't a casual meeting. "Thanks for coming in," he said. I placed the leather folder on the table between us. "Before we begin, I want you to know this isn't about creating trouble for my family. It's about making sure legally binding arrangements are respected." He gave a short nod, his expression shifting from cordial to cautious. "I'm listening." I opened the folder and began sliding documents across the table. 15 years ago, my grandfather established the Harrison-Harrington Trust. The property title for Oak Ridge was transferred into it, and I've been the sole trustee since I turned 21. The estate is not currently owned by my parents. They have no legal authority to transfer it. Graham's eyes narrowed slightly as he flipped through the paperwork. The more he read, the more his posture straightened. His silence wasn't defensive, it was focused. "These are legitimate," he said finally, tapping the original deed transfer. "And the trust has never been dissolved?" "No. And all financial obligations, mortgage, maintenance, taxes, have been handled through the trust. I've been covering those costs personally." He paused on the page, listing my payments over the past 10 years. His brow furrowed. "Your family doesn't know?" "No." He looked up at me again, this time with a different kind of curiosity, one that edged toward respect. "Well," he said slowly, "this changes everything." I nodded. "That's why I wanted to tell you before the title search turned it up. I wanted to be part of how this unfolds." "To be clear," he said, "your parents can't transfer Oak Ridge. Not without your signature, and the quitclaim deed would be invalid," I said. "Because I'm not relinquishing anything that legally belongs to them. I'm upholding the trust." He leaned back, processing. "This is going to be difficult news for your father and James." "I know," I said. "That's why I want your help. I want to present this to my family, in person, with you there. Not to start a war, but to establish the truth and talk about what comes next." For the first time since I'd walked in, Graham gave a small, tight smile. "I appreciate how you've handled this. A lot of people would have waited for the hammer to fall. You're offering a conversation instead. That's all I ever wanted." We spent the next 30 minutes planning the logistics of the meeting. Graham would arrange it for the following evening at Oak Ridge. He would present the legal documents, but I would lead the conversation. By the time I left his office, the sky had cleared. Sunlight filtered through the high rises, streaking the glass with gold. I stepped out onto the street and breathed in the crisp air. Tomorrow would be hard. There would be hurt, denial, maybe even anger, but there would also be truth. And in the end, truth is what holds legacies together. To anyone listening, if you've ever had to hold on to something important in silence, if you've sacrificed without recognition, if you've watched others get credit for what you built, know this: your quiet strength is not wasted. Your efforts matter. Even if no one sees them right away, they are real. And one day, when the time is right, your truth will have its moment, and it will stand tall. The next day felt like waiting for a storm you knew was coming but couldn't outrun. I went through the motions at the museum, reviewed some acquisition reports, met briefly with one of the curators about an upcoming exhibit, but it was all background noise. My mind was entirely elsewhere. Every ticking minute pushed me closer to the conversation that would change everything. By 5:30, I was already driving through the winding road to Oak Ridge. The evening sun was low, casting that amber glow over the trees that always made them look older, wiser, like they'd seen everything that had come before, and they weren't surprised by anything anymore. As I turned into the drive, I caught a glimpse of Graham's car behind me. That was good. I wanted him there before things began, to help steady the ground I was about to crack open. I parked in the main circular drive, this time not off to the side like usual. It was a small act of defiance, I suppose, but it also felt like claiming my space. I had earned that spot in more ways than one. The front door opened before I knocked. My mother stood there, her smile a little more forced this time. "Alexandra," she said, stepping aside. "Mr. Sutton, good to see you again. We weren't expecting you both to arrive together." "We had a few things to go over," I said, brushing past her into the foyer. The house was warm, too warm. That always happened when my mother was nervous. She'd crank the heat up like comfort could be manufactured. The smell of her lemon polish was strong, and fresh flowers sat everywhere, as if this were a celebratory evening instead of a reckoning. My father and James were already in the library. Of course they were. James sat in grandfather's old leather chair, legs crossed, looking perfectly at ease. My father stood by the fireplace, hands in his pockets, watching us as we entered. Graham gave a courteous nod as we all sat down. Catherine wasn't there. I noticed that immediately. "Where's Catherine?" I asked. "She's meeting with the designer," James said dismissively. "I'll fill her in later if there's anything she needs to know." The nerve of it made me bite the inside of my cheek to keep from reacting. Once we were all seated, Graham turned to me, deferring to me to start. This was my moment, my truth. "I asked for this meeting," I said, looking each of them in the eye, "because there's something important about Oak Ridge that you all need to know. Something that directly impacts the property transfer." My father's brow furrowed. "The paperwork is moving along just fine." "What could possibly—" "I'm going to explain," I interrupted, opening my briefcase. I pulled out the documents Walter had prepared and laid them neatly on the table between us. 15 years ago, Grandfather Harrison established a trust, the Harrison-Harrington Trust. The deed to Oak Ridge was transferred into that trust. Since I turned 21, I've been the sole trustee. That means, legally, Oak Ridge doesn't belong to you anymore, and it hasn't for a very long time. Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room so completely, it becomes its own presence. My father stared at the paperwork, like it was written in a language he didn't understand. My mother's hand moved to her throat, her eyes wide with disbelief. "James." Well, James looked like someone had punched him in the gut. "That's not possible," my father said at last, voice tight. My father would have never done something like that without telling me. "He did," I replied quietly. "He told Walter. He left me a letter. He made his wishes very clear." Graham spoke then, his tone careful. "I've reviewed the documents myself, Edward. The trust is real. It's legally binding. And Alexandra's role as trustee is fully documented. James leaned forward, snatching the paperwork to flip through it. "This shows you've been paying for everything," he said, disbelief lacing his voice. "The mortgage, the taxes, staff salaries?" "Yes," I said. "For 10 years. Where did you get the money?" My mother asked, dazed. "I've lived modestly, invested well, and grandfather left a financial foundation in the trust. I used it wisely." My father had gone pale, not angry yet just stunned. His voice, when it came, was low. "So you've been controlling Oak Ridge all this time, letting us think that it was still yours?" I finished for him. "I followed the terms grandfather set. He asked that the trust remain confidential unless it became absolutely necessary. And now it is." My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling. "Why didn't you tell us? Would you have believed me?" I asked, more gently than I felt. "Or would you have dismissed it like every other thing I've tried to share over the years?" That landed harder than I intended. She flinched. My father's jaw tightened. James looked like he might explode. "This is absurd," he said. "You can't just take everything. You can't." "I'm not taking anything," I said calmly. "I'm honoring what's already mine to protect." The air in the room turned electric. Graham cleared his throat. "The trust cannot be undone without Alexandra's consent. Any attempt to transfer the estate will fail once the title search reaches the trust." "So what happens now?" my mother asked, eyes glossy. "That's what we need to talk about," I said, softening my tone. "I'm not here to throw anyone out. I'm not here to punish you. But things are going to change. And we're going to do this the right way, from the truth up." As I looked around the room at the disbelief, the shame, the slow unraveling of assumptions, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear, resolved. Because this wasn't just about a house. This was about what was fair, about finally being heard. And if you've ever sat quietly while someone else claimed the spotlight you lit for them, if you've ever held something together while everyone else assumed it would always be there, let this be your reminder. You don't need to shout to be strong. Sometimes, the most powerful voice is the one that speaks calmly when everything else is crumbling. And when you speak your truth, no matter how long it's taken, it matters. It always matters. The silence after my last words hung in the air, like a thread stretched too tight. My mother sat frozen, her lips parted slightly, as if words had started but never made it out. My father leaned back slowly in his chair, jaw clenched, still trying to absorb it all. And James looked at me with something between betrayal and disbelief. His world, the one he'd been so certain about, had shifted in an instant. For a long moment, no one moved. Finally, it was my father who broke the quiet. "I need to speak with Walter," he said, his voice low but steady. "If this trust exists, if he's known about it all this time, he and I have a great deal to discuss." "Walter was following grandfather's wishes," I replied. "His legal obligation was to the person who created the trust, not to you. That was the agreement. Grandfather kept it quiet for a reason." My father's eyes flickered with something I hadn't seen before. Not anger, not arrogance. Something closer to embarrassment. "I can't believe he would leave us out of this," he murmured, mostly to himself. "He didn't," I said gently. "He chose to include someone he trusted to carry it forward. He just didn't choose you." The truth of that hurt him. I saw it in the way he blinked, slowly, like the words had hit someplace deeper than he'd expected. James let out a bitter laugh. "So what? Now you're in charge? Of all of it?" "I've always been in charge," I said quietly. "You just didn't know." He stood up abruptly, pacing. "This is insane. We've already started planning renovations. Catherine met with a contractor last week. The nursery, the guest rooms, what are we supposed to do? Stop everything?" "Yes," I said. "Until we figure this out together, yes." He stared at me, incredulous. "You're going to block us from living in our own family home?" "It's not your home," I said, my voice sharp now, though I didn't raise it, at least not yet. Grandfather didn't just want someone to live in Oak Ridge. He wanted someone to preserve it. My mother finally spoke again, her voice quieter than usual. "Is that what you want, Alexandra? To turn Oak Ridge into some kind of museum?" "No," I said, softer now. but I want it to be respected. I want it to mean something. And that doesn't happen by gutting the East Wing to build extra closets. The room went quiet again. Graham shifted in his chair, glancing at the documents one last time before he spoke. As the attorney handling the transfer, I can confirm this process is legally blocked until the trust is addressed. Edward, the first recommend we hold off on any next steps until a new family meeting is arranged with full legal counsel present. Alexandra's trustee status can't be ignored. My father gave a curt nod, his face unreadable. We'll speak to Walter tomorrow, he said. James, let's go. James didn't look at me as he left. My mother, still stunned, followed them slowly. It was the first time I'd seen her unsure of what to say. As they disappeared down the hall, Graham turned to me. You handled that better than most people would have. I'm not interested in revenge, I said. Just truth, and something resembling fairness. He gave a thoughtful nod, gathering his notes. Most families wouldn't come out of this intact, he said. But you didn't burn it all down tonight. That matters more than you realize. After he left, I stood in the center of the library for a long time. The light had faded, and the chandelier overhead cast a golden warmth over the antique books. The shelves I'd helped repair. The ceiling mural, now fully restored, gleamed softly above. I had done all of that, quietly, alone. And finally, they knew. As I reached for my coat, I passed the tall windows that overlooked the gardens. They were dark now, but I could still make out the outlines of the hedges and the stone path that led to the small fountain. I'd paid to restore years ago. No one had ever thanked me for it. No one had asked who had fixed it. But tonight, all of that had started to shift. In the car, I sat for a moment before starting the engine, resting my hands on the steering wheel. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. There would be follow-ups, negotiations, maybe even more resistance. But the hardest part, speaking the truth, was done. And I did it without yelling, without rage, without losing myself. To anyone who's ever been asked to shrink for someone else's comfort, let me tell you, standing in your truth doesn't require volume. It requires courage. Courage to hold steady when others question your place. Courage to stay kind, even when others aren't. And courage to walk into a room full of people who never saw you as the decision maker and calmly show them they were wrong. So if you're carrying something quietly, something real, something powerful, they might not see it yet. But that doesn't make it any less true. Your strength is not defined by who notices it. It's defined by who you become when no one's looking. The day after the confrontation at Oak Ridge passed, without a single phone call. Not from my parents, not from James, not even from Catherine, which, frankly, surprised me the most. She'd always struck me as someone who preferred control over uncertainty. But maybe even she didn't know how to navigate this one. I spent the morning back at the museum, grateful for the normalcy. There was a kind of comfort in walking among the quiet displays, centuries-old artifacts that had survived wars, floods, time itself. I thought about Oak Ridge then, not just as a house, but as part of something bigger, a legacy, a story, one that deserved care and dignity, not demolition for a bigger closet or a kitchen island. Around noon, my assistant, Marcus, stepped into my office. "There's a Mr. Jenkins here to see you." I blinked. "Walter? Unannounced?" "Send him in," I said, standing. Walter moved a little slower than usual as he entered. His face was serious, but there was something kind behind his eyes. He carried his worn leather briefcase and a folded newspaper under one arm. When he sat, I could tell it had been a long morning. "I just came from a 3-hour meeting with your father and James," he said without preamble. "I thought you should hear what was said from me, not them." My heart kicked up a little. "Go on," Walter sighed, leaning back. "Your father did everything short of slamming his fist on my desk. He asked why I hadn't told him about the trust, accused me of secrecy, manipulation, favoritism." I swallowed. "And you told him?" "That my legal obligation was to your grandfather and the terms of the trust," Walter said. "That Harrison gave me clear, written instructions to keep the trust confidential until you chose to reveal it or turned 40, whichever came first." I nodded, grateful but unsettled. Did they accept that? In the end, Walter said, yes. Your father brought in one of his firm's estate specialists. They reviewed everything. The trust is airtight, Alexandra. Your position is secure. They know now that there's no way around you. I leaned forward slightly. So what happens next? Walter opened his briefcase and pulled out a few pages. They've drafted a counter-proposal. I skimmed the first page. It was carefully worded, respectful even. But beneath the polite tone was something else, an attempt to dilute my authority. They want the family council to have equal votes, I said aloud. No final say from the trustee. Yes, Walter said. And they've proposed creating a separate family foundation to manage Oak Ridge's finances. Your father would fund the majority. James would contribute annually. And I'd just, what? Step back? Become a ceremonial figure? Walter shook his head. Not quite. They included language suggesting you'd remain involved, but it's clear they're uncomfortable with how much power you currently have. I looked out the window, my fingers resting against the smooth edge of the document. They don't care about Oak Ridge's legacy, I said quietly. Not really. They care about image, convenience, optics. They never once asked what grandfather wanted. Walter watched me carefully. That's why he chose you. He reached into his briefcase one more time and pulled out a small envelope. Your grandfather left one more thing. I hadn't planned to give it to you until your birthday, but I think now's the right time. I opened it slowly. It was a short note, no more than 3 lines, written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Alexandra, whatever path you choose, remember this. Our family's strength has never been in titles or money. It's in quiet resolve. It's in choosing what's right when no one else will. I always saw that in you, H. I read it twice, then a third time. My chest ached, but it wasn't pain. It was something else, a sense of being seen, understood. Even in his absence, he still knew what I needed to hear. I'm not dissolving the trust, I said softly, but I'll consider compromise on my terms. Walter nodded. That's what I thought you'd say. They've requested another meeting. This time, everyone will be there. Catherine, too. I smiled faintly. That should be fun. Will you need me there? Yes. And I'm bringing someone else too, Dr. Eleanor Blackwood. Walter's eyebrows lifted. She's from the Historical Preservation Society, I explained. She conducted the restoration assessment on Oak Ridge a few years ago. I want someone at the table who knows what should and shouldn't be touched. Someone objective. Walter chuckled, impressed. You're not just protecting a house. You're protecting the soul of the place. That's exactly it. After he left, I sat alone in my office, staring at the envelope and my grandfather's note. I thought about what it meant to stand alone in a room full of people who thought they knew best and still trust your gut. About what it meant to say no, even when saying yes might have been easier, more convenient. I'd been underestimated for so long that even I had started to doubt myself. But no more. To anyone listening, especially if you've ever felt like the quiet one in a loud room, please remember, strength isn't always the person speaking the most. It's often the one who waits until the noise settles and then says what matters. You don't need permission to protect what you love. You don't need approval to take a stand. What you need is faith in your worth, in your instincts, and in the fact that doing the right thing, however hard, is never wasted. Wednesday evening arrived cloaked in the kind of stillness that comes before a thunderstorm. The sky outside was the color of pewter, and the wind felt unsettled, like it couldn't decide which way it wanted to blow. I'd been on edge all day, focused, but taut inside. And now the time had come. I met Dr. Eleanor Blackwood at the base of Oak Ridge's long drive, just past the iron gates that had welcomed 5 generations of Harringtons. She drove her own car, a practical silver sedan that somehow felt more dignified than the flashy luxury cars usually parked here. As she stepped out, her expression was composed, but curious. I've been looking forward to this, she said as she adjusted her scarf. I've always found that when people are forced to confront the past in a physical space, it brings the truth into sharp focus. I'm counting on that, I replied, Together, we walked toward the house. The hedges had been recently trimmed, the flower beds carefully mulched. My mother was still putting on appearances, I thought. She always had a way of making the outside look perfect, no matter what was unraveling inside. Miss S. Winters answered the door before we could knock. She didn't say much, she never did, but she gave me a small nod as we stepped inside. A quiet recognition, a quiet loyalty. "They're all waiting in the library," she said. "Would you like tea?" "Maybe after," I said, offering her a small smile. The drawing room felt warmer than usual again, not just in temperature, but in tension. Everyone was already seated when we entered my parents, James, Catherine, and Walter near the fireplace. There were more folders on the table. Along with a printed agenda, someone had taken the time to type and staple. My father always did like a little formality when things got uncomfortable. Catherine was the first to rise. "Dr. Blackwood," she said, offering a firm handshake. "I've heard a lot about your work." "Thank you for coming," Eleanor smiled. "It's a pleasure to be here. Oak Ridge is an extraordinary property. I'm honored to help protect it." My father cleared his throat. "Shall we begin?" We all took our seats. Walter stood, ready to moderate again. This time, however, I noticed that everyone came into the conversation with a slightly different posture, still tense, but not as combative. Maybe because the shock had worn off. Maybe because the truth had settled in. "Let's begin with governance," Walter said. "Alexandra has reviewed the family's counter-proposal. She has some points to address." I nodded and took the lead. "First," I began, "the idea of a family council is fine with me, but the vote can't be equal across the board. The trust was designed with the intention that major decisions rest with a singular, guiding voice. That's not about ego, it's about consistency and accountability." My father frowned. "So you'd still have the final say?" "Yes," I replied, "but I'm open to structured input. Major structural changes, restorations, renovations, these can be brought to a vote. But historical integrity will take precedence, and I'll retain the authority to block anything that violates that principle." Dr. Blackwood stepped in then, her voice smooth and clear. "That's not unusual for properties of this significance," she said. "Historical estates often have oversight built into their management, particularly if preservation is a core value. If the family wishes to modernize certain areas, there's still room for creativity, but not at the expense of the home's character." Catherine nodded. "We're willing to work within those limits. I don't want to erase Oak Ridge's charm, just make parts of it more livable for a young family." That was the first moment I felt something close to collaboration from her. I looked across the table and gave a short nod. "I can work with that," I said. We moved on to finances. The idea of a Harrington Family Foundation was still on the table. My father presented his version of the funding structure. He'd contribute the majority of the initial capital, with James making annual contributions based on income. Catherine had even offered to host a small fundraising gala to support long-term preservation. "And your role in this foundation?" I asked, turning to my father. "You'd sit on the board," he said. "You'd have a vote, but not control." "Correct." I took a breath, considering. If I'm stepping back from full financial control, then transparency is non-negotiable. I want full access to all financial records. And any expenses related to modernization must go through a dual approval process, myself and one preservation expert. "That's fair, Doctor," Blackwood chimed in. "And I'd be happy to serve as that advisor, if the family agrees." My father glanced around the room. No one objected. "Fine," he said at last. We continued for another hour, combing through details. At some point, Mrs. Winters returned with tea and lemon cookies. I hadn't even realized I was hungry until I bit into one. It tasted just like it had when I was a child. Some things, thankfully, never change. As the meeting drew to a close, the air in the room had shifted. Not warm, exactly, but not sharp anymore. A truce, maybe. A shared acknowledgement that we were doing something hard for the sake of something worth protecting. "I know this hasn't been easy," I said, standing as the meeting ended. "And I'm not naive. There's still a long road ahead, but Oak Ridge matters. Not just because of who we are, but because of what it represents. And I think maybe now we're finally starting to honor that. Everyone was quiet for a beat. Then my mother stood. "I want to say something," she said. We all turned to her. "I've made mistakes," she began. "We all have. And for a long time, I didn't see what you were doing, Alexandra. I didn't see you. But I do now. And I want us to find a way forward, not just for the estate, but for us." It wasn't a full apology, but it was the closest thing to one I'd ever received from her. And in that moment, it was enough. As the others gathered their things and started drifting toward the hallway, Eleanor turned to me. "You've done something remarkable here," she said. "I just told the truth." "No," she said gently. "You held the truth long enough to know when to speak it. That takes more strength than most people realize. And you know what? She was right. So, if you're listening, and you've been carrying something that no one else sees your effort, your sacrifice, your wisdom, just know this. Not everyone will understand it right away. But that doesn't make it less valuable. And it doesn't make you less essential. Sometimes we wait years for recognition that should have come long ago. But when it comes, it's not too late." The week following that meeting felt different. The kind of different you feel in your bones, not just your calendar. For the first time in years, my family wasn't orbiting around assumptions. We were actually sitting in the same space, if not comfortably, then at least honestly. That was new, and it felt like progress. Walter and I met twice that week to draft formal documents reflecting the agreements made during the family meeting. The trust would remain intact. I would continue as trustee. The family foundation would be established with clearly defined roles, responsibilities, and oversight mechanisms. There were clauses for preservation, for renovations, for shared decision-making. Everything had a name now, a process, a plan, and somehow that made it real. The final step was to gather again, this time at Walter's office. A neutral space, away from the family home, away from old emotions baked into wallpaper and mahogany trim. A place where we could sign, agree, and move forward. We met on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, the kind of steady, spring rain that taps on the windows just loud enough to remind you it's there, but not enough to distract you from what matters. Walter had arranged everything. His conference room was neat and professional, a polished table with thick folders neatly stacked at each seat. My father arrived first. He was dressed in a dark suit and carried himself with that familiar air of authority. But something had softened around the edges. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was circumstance. Maybe it was just acceptance. My mother came in shortly after, her makeup flawless, her scarf carefully knotted. She smiled at me, not big, not performative, but small and sincere. It was the first time in a long time I didn't look away. James and Catherine arrived together. She carried a slim laptop bag and a sleek pen, clearly ready to review every page. James looked tired, maybe humbled, but he nodded when he saw me. No smug grin this time, just a nod. I returned it. Walter stood at the head of the table. "Thank you all for being here," he began. "Today is not about revisiting the past. It's about protecting the future. You've all worked hard to find common ground, and now we formalize those efforts." We each took our seats. Walter handed out the documents, starting with the updated trust language, followed by the bylaws for the Harrington Family Foundation. I flipped through the pages slowly. It was surreal to see it all in writing. Decisions that had once been whispered behind closed doors, now typed in black ink, notarized, witnessed. James leaned over to read something in Catherine's folder. She murmured something back, and for once, there wasn't any tension in it. No sides, no battles, just cooperation. When it was my turn to sign, I picked up the pen and paused for a moment. Not for drama, not for effect, just to take it in. I thought about the years I had quietly supported Oak Ridge, the invoices I'd paid without a word, the late nights reviewing budgets instead of planning vacations, the hollow feeling of being overlooked while others made decisions as if I were invisible. And now, here I was, signing a document that put the truth on paper. That gave voice to everything I had carried in silence. I signed. One by one, the others followed. And just like that, it was done. Afterward, we gathered for lunch at Westfield's, the same private club where I'd met Walter not long ago. It was my father's idea, surprisingly. Maybe he wanted to mark the moment with something more than a signature. We sat at a round table near the windows. The rain had let up, and the gray sky was beginning to split, just enough for a little light to sneak through. The conversation was surprisingly easy. We talked about neutral things at first: weather, the museum's upcoming exhibit, a local charity Catherine was helping with. But as dessert came around, something shifted. James set down his fork and looked at me. "I know I haven't said this," he began, "and I probably should have a long time ago. But thank you for what you did, for Oak Ridge, for keeping it going when we didn't even realize it needed saving." The table went quiet. My mother reached over and placed a hand on his. "I second that," she said. "And I hope you know, Alexandra, that I'm proud of you. We may not have shown it well, but your grandfather saw something in you. And I see it now, too." My throat tightened. I didn't speak for a moment. I just nodded, because anything more would have cracked me open right there. After lunch, we stood outside for a few minutes. My father pulled me aside. "Your grandfather made the right choice," he said, his voice lower now. "I didn't see it then. I thought I knew what was best. But you carried more than I ever realized." It wasn't a grand apology, but it was honest. And I think at this point in our lives, honesty means more than perfection. That night, back in my apartment, I stood by the window watching the clouds drift apart, letting the last light of the day peek through. The rain had washed everything clean, and Oak Ridge was still standing. To anyone listening, sometimes we go years, decades, even carrying the weight of what no one else sees. We do it quietly because we believe it matters. And maybe we tell ourselves it's not about recognition, and maybe it isn't. But let me tell you, when that moment finally comes, when the truth is spoken, when your efforts are finally seen, it matters so much. Because what you did in the dark helped something beautiful survive. And now that it's in the light, don't be afraid to stand in it. You've earned it. Spring moved in slowly that year. The trees along the Oak Ridge drive unfurled their leaves, one cautious bud at a time, as if unsure whether it was really safe to bloom again. And honestly, I understood the feeling. It had been nearly a month since we signed the documents that put Oak Ridge's future on stable ground. A month since the estate had officially been placed in the hands of both the family and the foundation. And in that short time, something remarkable had started to happen, not in big, sweeping changes, but in gentle, almost unnoticeable shifts. James and Catherine had begun work on the East Wing, as agreed. They were careful, thoughtful. Dr. Blackwood reviewed the plans, and I'd even met with the contractor myself. Not once did I feel overridden or dismissed. Instead, there were honest questions, respectful conversations. Would grandfather have wanted this layout? James had asked during one of our walkthroughs. It surprised me to hear him say it. Not just because he asked, but because he meant it. I'd looked at him for a long moment before answering. He would have wanted the house to feel alive, just as long as the bones were left intact. He'd nodded. "Then we'll do that. Keep the bones." That phrase stuck with me. Keep the bones. Because isn't that what legacy really is? Not the paint or the wallpaper or even the furniture. It's the structure underneath, the values, the choices. The foundation you keep standing no matter what else gets built around it. I'd returned to Oak Ridge every weekend since the signing. Not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. The more the estate grew back into itself under shared stewardship, not silent sacrifice, the more I felt connected to it, not burdened by it. My mother, too, had changed in her own quiet way. One Saturday afternoon, I found her in the garden, wearing her old gloves and pruning a row of roses that hadn't been touched in months. "Mrs. Winters says the soil's gone acidic," she muttered, almost offensively, as I stepped closer. "They'll never bloom if we don't fix it." I smiled. "You used to hate getting dirt under your nails." She glanced up, her expression unreadable. Maybe I just didn't have a good enough reason before. That was her way, I realized. Apologies and emotions didn't come in direct lines. but the meaning still landed. We stood there for a few minutes, the sun warming the backs of our necks, the air thick with the scent of lavender and old stone. After a while, she spoke again. Your grandfather used to say, Oak Ridge could bring out the worst in people or the best. It just depended on how much you were willing to see. I nodded, quietly understanding. Maybe that's what this house had done to all of us. Brought everything to the surface, the pain, the resentment, the pride, the silence. But now, finally, we were starting to see, not just each other, but ourselves. The following week, I invited Eleanor Blackwood for lunch. We sat in the conservatory, where vines curled gently along the edges of the glass, their tendrils reaching for sun. I served her tea in one of my grandmother's delicate porcelain sets, the kind usually reserved for holidays. I have to say, she remarked, stirring in honey, I wasn't sure how it would all turn out. Neither was I admitted. But I've worked with dozens of historic estates, she continued, and I can count on one hand the number that managed to balance history, family, and modern life. What you've done here? It's rare. I let that sit for a moment, not out of pride, but out of something gentler peace. I think we were all so busy fighting for our place in the story, I said, that we forgot the story itself was worth protecting. Eleanor smiled. And now that you've remembered? Now we build around the truth, I said. Not in spite of it. Later that afternoon, I walked through the house again. Only this time, I brought a notebook with me. In it, I began listing items in each room, not for appraisal or record keeping, but for a new idea that had started to take shape. I wanted to create a detailed archive of Oak Ridge's history, a living document, something for the next generation to hold in their hands, because someday someone might walk these halls and wonder about the people who came before them. What we built, what we preserved, what we almost lost. And I wanted them to know. As I stood once more in the library, I looked out the tall windows and saw James in the distance, walking with Catherine. She held his arm, and they were talking softly, laughing even. I didn't feel resentment. I didn't feel envy. I felt whole. It had taken me years to find my voice in this family. To speak a truth no one was ready to hear, to carry a responsibility that had felt impossibly lonely at times. But I'd done it, and not for revenge, not for control, for Oak Ridge, for grandfather, for me. To those listening now, maybe you've spent a lifetime being the quiet one, the one doing the work, holding the weight, keeping things going while others took the credit. Maybe you've wondered if anyone would ever notice. Let me remind you of something. Quiet strength isn't invisible. It just takes time to be recognized. But when it is, it leaves a mark no one can undo. And if you've ever been the one holding the foundation while everyone else rearranged the furniture, I see you. I promise your steadiness is what holds it all together. Summer arrived gently that year. Not in a dramatic burst, but like an old friend slipping into a seat beside you. The air at Oak Ridge grew softer, the windows stayed open longer, and the gardens bloomed with a kind of grace I hadn't seen in years. Even the house itself felt lighter, like it had been holding its breath for too long. And now it could finally exhale. The renovations to the East Wing were well underway. James and Catherine had worked closely with Dr. Blackwood and the contractor to preserve what they could and modernize what they needed. The updated floor plan included a nursery, a guest suite, and a cozy reading room tucked into what used to be a storage space. They didn't touch the crown molding, or the window casings, or the hand-carved banister that wound its way up the back stairs. They understood now, not just the rules, but the why behind them. I'd stopped by one afternoon to check in and found James standing in the hallway, squinting up at an old framed photograph of our great-grandfather holding a lantern on the front porch. He didn't notice me right away. He looks like a ghost, doesn't he? I said gently. James turned, and for once, he didn't bristle. He just smiled a little. Yeah, kind of haunting, but comforting too. I stepped closer. He used to bring the lantern out to check the grounds every night before bed. Said it helped him sleep, knowing the place was safe. Maybe that's what we've all been doing, James said. walking around in the dark with a light, trying to keep the place safe. I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw not the brother who used to tease me mercilessly, or the man who once dismissed me outright, but someone trying, someone learning. "You're doing a good job, James," I said. "You and Catherine both." He nodded, quietly. Before I left, Catherine stopped me near the newly installed French doors. "We're thinking of naming the baby after someone in the family," she said. "If it's a girl, we like the name Eleanor." It took me a second to realize she didn't mean me. "You mean Dr. Blackwood?" I asked, surprised. "She's been so patient," Catherine said, "and wise. I don't know. There's just something steady about her. We want our daughter to have that kind of strength." I smiled. She'd be honored. Truthfully, I was too. Back at the museum, life had taken on a steady rhythm again. The Revolutionary War exhibit I'd spent months preparing was finally open to the public. Guests came in waves, some with grandkids in tow, others walking slowly from glass case to glass case, reading every plaque like it was a prayer. One afternoon, I found an older woman lingering near a display of handwritten letters from a Union soldier to his wife. She wiped at her eyes, gently, and turned to me. "I had a letter like that," she whispered, "from my husband during Vietnam." I reached out and touched her arm. "Would you like to sit? I can bring you some water." She shook her head. "No, I just didn't expect to feel it so deeply." That's what stories do, I thought. Whether on paper or in wood and stone, they remind us that we've loved and lost and survived. That evening, I sat in my office and added another section to the Oak Ridge archive, this time documenting the newly renovated East Wing, complete with photos, design notes, and quotes from both James and Catherine about the choices they made. "We wanted to keep the character," Catherine had said in her interview. "We wanted our child to grow up with a sense of place, of legacy." It made me proud, not in the boastful way, but the way you feel when something you've nurtured begins to grow on its own. The next Sunday, the entire family gathered for dinner at Oak Ridge. It was the first time we'd done that in almost a year. My mother prepared roast chicken and garden vegetables. My father opened a bottle of red wine that had been sitting in the cellar since 1998. "I figured it was time," he said, as he poured. "No sense letting the good things just sit there untouched." We ate at the long dining room table, candles flickering gently, and for the first time in a long time, there was laughter, real laughter. James told a story about trying to assemble the nursery crib without instructions. My mother shared a memory of my grandfather dancing with her in the entryway after her high school graduation. Even my father joined in, describing the time he snuck into the library as a boy and accidentally spilled ink on an original land deed. "Walter never forgave me," he said, smiling. "I'm pretty sure he had it framed out of spite." I sat there, listening, watching, letting the warmth of it all settle in. And when dessert came, apple tart, my favorite, my mother placed a small envelope beside my plate. I looked up, confused. "Open it," she said gently. Inside was a handwritten letter. "Dear Alexandra, you've given more to this family than we ever knew, and though it took us far too long to say it, we're grateful. Your grandfather trusted you for a reason. We see that now, and we hope you'll forgive the years we didn't. Love, Mom and Dad." It was short, but it was enough. To anyone listening tonight, I want to offer you this thought. Sometimes, healing doesn't come with fireworks. Sometimes it comes in softened voices, shared meals, and small envelopes placed beside dessert. Sometimes it comes after years of holding steady, standing tall, and doing the right thing even when no one's clapping. But when it does come, it's worth every quiet step you took to get there. So hold on. Keep showing up for the things that matter, because one day someone will place a letter in your hand, and you'll know they finally see you. The last pages of a story are never truly the end. They're a pause, maybe, a breath, a place to rest before the next chapter begins. That's what Oak Ridge felt like now, a place between what had been and what was still becoming. It was a warm Sunday morning in late August when we held the first official Harrington Foundation gathering on the estate grounds. Nothing too fancy, no press, just family, a few close friends, and a handful of folks from the Historical Society. Mrs. Winters had outdone herself. She prepared a spread that reminded me of summers from childhood: deviled eggs, chilled lemonade, chicken salad on soft butter rolls, and a peach cobbler that disappeared in minutes. James grilled. Catherine floated between groups with effortless charm, her growing belly gently leading the way. As for me, I spent most of the afternoon doing what I hadn't done in years, simply enjoying the space. I walked barefoot across the cool grass, stood beneath the shade of the old oaks, watched the light dance across the glass panes of the conservatory. I let the past rest for a while. At one point, my father pulled me aside. We stood together on the porch, looking out over the lawn where children ran between the hedges and adults sipped wine in the shade. "It feels different now," he said, "but not in a bad way." I nodded, quiet. "I used to think legacy meant control," he continued, "keeping everything in line, holding on to every decision, every inch. But it doesn't, does it?" "No," I said softly. "It means care and letting go when it's time." He looked at me then, really looked. "You've taught me something, Alexandra, something I should have learned a long time ago." It was one of the few times in my life I saw him not as a parent, but simply as a man, flawed, proud, trying. "Thank you," he said. That's all. Just those 2 words. But they landed. Later that evening, after everyone had gone and the lanterns were dimmed, I wandered back into the library. It felt like it always had. Still, sacred. Like the house held its own breath when the sun dipped low. I sat by the fireplace and opened the Oak Ridge Archive, the living history project I'd been building piece by piece. Tonight, I added something new, a letter, not an artifact, not a receipt or photo or deed, just my voice. To whoever finds this, Oak Ridge isn't just a home, it's a story. It holds laughter and loss, quiet mornings and stormy nights. It remembers the footsteps of those who cared and the silences of those who forgot. If you're reading this, it means you're now part of it too. And I hope you carry forward what we've learned. That family isn't built on who speaks the loudest, but who listens the longest. That legacy isn't about perfection, it's about preservation, of values, of space, of truth. Be gentle with this place, and with each other. It matters. Alexandra Harrington, the first, placed the letter into the back of the binder and closed it. The weight of it felt right, like something finished and something just beginning. As I stepped outside one last time, I stood at the top of the porch steps and looked out across the estate. The trees were glowing in the last orange light of day. A soft breeze lifted the hem of my dress, and I smiled, because I knew Oak Ridge was going to be okay. Not because it had been protected by law or paper or even money, but because people had finally started seeing it, valuing it, letting it grow in the ways it needed, just like we had. So, if you've come with me this far, thank you. Maybe this story reminded you of something you once fought for, or someone you once stood beside. Maybe it brought back a house, a porch, a conversation you still remember even after all these years. And maybe, just maybe, it reminded you of your own quiet strength. Because here's what I've learned. You don't need a title or a trust or a grand old estate to be someone who protects what matters. You just need courage. Courage to carry the weight when no one notices. Courage to speak the truth when it's hard. Courage to forgive, even when it's undeserved. And courage to keep showing up day after day, because love, in all its messy, complicated, beautiful forms, is worth the effort. So hold fast to what matters. Stand tall in what's right. And if the world ever tells you your voice is too quiet, your care too small, don't listen. Because quiet people have kept the world turning for centuries. And you're one of them. Thank you for listening. And if this story touched you, I hope you carry a piece of it with you into your home, your family, your own legacy. You're more powerful than you think. And your story is not over yet. At its heart, this story reminds us that doing the right thing, especially when no one is watching, is one of life's quietest but most powerful acts of love. Alexandra's journey is not just about preserving a house, it's about preserving values, dignity, and connection in a world that often forgets the importance of those things. For those of us in our later years, it speaks deeply to something we've known all along, that legacy isn't about money or names etched in stone. It's about what we protect, who we uplift, and how we choose to care, even when others don't recognize the effort. Many of us have lived lives where we quietly held families together, carried burdens behind closed doors, and made sacrifices that no one ever fully saw. This story honors that experience. It reminds us that even if appreciation comes late, or not at all, the truth of our efforts still matters. It still counts. And sometimes, when the time is right, the recognition does arrive. So if you've ever wondered whether your steady hands and quiet love made a difference, let this story reassure you they did, and they always will. Your presence, your care, your voice, they've shaped the world more than you know.